Hi, good
Hi.
morning, Kim. Yeah,
Hello.
I wonder if you could say something about your role and your practice just to introduce yourself.
Absolutely, sure. So I'm Kim Loliya. I'm the director of Black Psychotherapy. We are a Black-led mental health service based in Brixton and also virtually as well. And we're a team of just over 30 people. And our focus is on decolonial, intersectional, and anti-oppressive practice. So my role is primarily within the service, supporting the team. I also supervise, and I'm also a trauma psychotherapist.
Fantastic, thank you. That's kind of really helpful. And actually, some of the aims of your organisation are directly related to why we're meeting today. And it was just really to hear from you a bit about how you think supervisors can set up a supervision space that is anti-oppressive.
hmm Well, I guess the starting point for me is understanding that supervision as a space doesn't exist in isolation. It's very much located within a context of systemic oppression and various kind of influences of power and privilege and how that intersects with identity. So it perhaps it's about kind of moving out of this illusion of neutrality and acknowledging that supervision, like any relationship, is informed by systemic oppression and that we need to acknowledge it, we need to find ways of talking about it, and of course we need to find ways to subvert it as well and to act in, solidarity with marginalized groups.
Indeed. And you were talking about kind of, wider kind of structures that sustain kind of oppression of kind of various groups, and that we need to kind of talk about it. And I wonder, the audience listening to this are going to be supervisors sitting down with trainee kind of clinical psychologists. What can they do to help set up a space where it can be talked about, where we can think about these wider structures of oppression?
Sure. Well, it can really start with as we're looking at our clinical work and exploring the different factors and what might be affecting a client's mental health, it's starting to broaden the gaze and bring in conversations about systems. It might be saying, how does this person's anxiety link to their everyday experience of racism? Or, what is it like for this person, having migration trauma? To now live in a world where perhaps that isn't an identity that's visible or that's something that isn't acknowledged, or how do they then relate given that background and how that might be showing up in their body and in their mind. So it's that piece around curiosity, but it's also perhaps going into naming the impact of whiteness. So what happens when this client with this history of, racism, sexism, homophobia, etc., and everyday experience interacts with a practitioner, with a clinician who is a white-bodied person who maybe doesn't have an understanding of queerness or transness that's from their lived experience. So, what is that like? How do we bridge that gap and create as much safety as possible? And maybe it's also acknowledging that within our work we can do what we can, but it's never going to be 100% safe because the systems that we live in don't create absolute safety for us. And that can be a process of also grieving and understanding the limits of what we can do, but within that empowering ourselves to do as much as possible to work in a way that is, anti-colonial, decolonial, and of course anti-oppressive as well.
Thinking there about how broadening the gaze when we're thinking kind of about the experience of clients, when we're conceptualizing and understanding kind of what might be going on for them. I was thinking more specifically about the supervisory relationship and how you can create a relationship where these things are more able to be talked about, and what might kind of contribute to that.
hmm Well, I guess for me, it's important to, as a supervisor, when I start building a supervisory relationship with somebody, I'm very clear and very transparent about my lived experience and my identities. And I am engaging with my supervisees to also understand their identities, their positionality. And I very much talk about power, the power that I hold as a supervisor, as a practitioner who's more experienced, and what it might be like for them to relate to me. It's very much my responsibility to create enough emotional safety to be able to have conversations that might be really delicate, like burnout, or exploring aspects of practice where somebody might be feeling really lost, or they might be feeling like they said something racist or they made a mistake, and there might be a lot of shame around that. So I guess I go in with vulnerability and with a sense of really trying to, work relationally with someone to meet them, but also with a certain skill and a certain language where I'm able to have conversations that talk about power and talk about, the systemic components and how that might be showing up very much in the here and now with the person.
Okay, so you're saying there about, kind of sharing your own position about kind of transparency, but putting power differences on the agenda and you kind of taking responsibility that that is there. Are there any particular practices or techniques that you've used with supervisees that help them engage with that kind of those sort of dialogues?
I mean, I guess a general practice is really being in an inquiry around, is this useful? Are these conversations that we're having useful? That, reflexive piece, very much kind of as part of day-to-day conversations, and being able to evaluate and being able to share feedback together, because that will show me also the aspects of my practice where perhaps I'm not seeing something clearly or explaining something clearly. And it comes from also that piece around cultural humility, not starting from a place where I necessarily, have a sense of someone's culture in its fullness. There might be learning that I need to do, as well as conversations about labor. So, um, you know, being perhaps like having conversations around anti-oppressive practice, but then being able to say to a supervisee, I recognize that this is my labor that I need to do. I now need to go away and do my own learning here. This isn't something that I'm putting onto you, so that they also recognize that I'm aware of my own power. I'm aware that it's not their job to educate me, and particularly if they have multiple marginalizations, and they already educate people, day to day. What I don't want is for them to feel that they have to do that with me as well.
Sure. So, yeah, just and that chimes with some of the things we put in our practice guidance about it be, what are the supervisor responsibilities about going away, kind of doing your own learning, doing that kind of labor, as you put it. I suppose one question is, for some of our supervisors around this issue, I think there is a fear about getting it wrong. I think sensitive to that, I can't put it on my supervisee to educate me, and then sometimes they get a bit stuck there. And I just wondered if you could talk about some kind of starting points for opening up these conversations.
Well, I think there's a contracting piece in any supervisory relationship, which is really around what happens when we do get it wrong, because we are. Because we're, we're going to have to learn. And in our learning process, in any learning process, we are going to maybe miss something. The language is always evolving, terminology is evolving, our kind of collective understanding of anti-oppressive practice. It's such an emergent field, which is a really beautiful thing, but it's constantly in evolution, which means that at some point we will realize that, we might sort of bump up against our limitations in whatever way and get it wrong, which in and of itself is a very kind of colonial frame for something. But it's really about acknowledging that, at some point that will happen, and at some point there might be some feelings about that on both sides. What do we do? Let's talk about that. Let's acknowledge that that's going to be a reality, and maybe that's even, if you're really in the thick of it, if you're really in the ring, it's going to happen more often than not because you're pushing against the edges together, which means that, you know, in that kind of closeness, there might be, you might overstep. So how do we hold that compassionately? How do we move forward? How, you know, what do we need to say to each other? What do we need to, how do we repair? You know, talking about that earlier on, you know, even from the beginning, from the first supervision session, I think creates more of a culture of safety. And then when something happens, it's then possible to say, okay, well, we've, you know, spoken about it before. Let's practice, you know, what we've contracted or what we've agreed. And of course, those practices of repair will, you know, evolve over time as there's trust. But it's about, you know, starting from there.
Yeah, that's a really interesting reframe. So as opposed to being anxious about getting things wrong, having discussions about how we might respond when things go wrong, or when mistakes are made, or we get things wrong in these kind of discussions, actually helps create that safety, which makes a space where those kind of conversations can happen more readily.
Yeah. And also it's a sign that if we are getting things wrong, we're trying and we're taking risks. And those are the qualities in terms of building anti-oppressive practice. We can't do it if we're always in our comfort zone. It requires a degree of vulnerability, and mistakes are part of that. So if anything, it's something to celebrate that, you know, we're in this together, we're doing our best, and yeah, and we're moving through it.
Yeah. But from some supervisors is that um, you know, they've developed some skills and experience about introducing these conversations around contracting at the beginning of supervision, but sometimes it can be hard to sustain that focus. And I just
Mhm.
wondered if you could say a bit about what can enable that, what can support practitioners to keep that focus on thinking intersectionally, anti-oppressively, in an ongoing way in supervision.
Well, there's a piece around reviewing the work regularly. So, you know, after the initial contracting, having these, you know, regular, even ideally even diarized conversations. So it's on the agenda, it's on the table. There's that reflexive piece is very much ongoing, but also being able to infuse the relationship with new ideas, new learning, you know, to be able to say, um, this webinar is going on, or this conference is going on, or you know, I'm reading this book and I was wondering how it fits in with the work that we're doing. So it's not just about, you know, the initial kind of like, you know, having that intention around anti-racism. It's also let's keep talking about it. These are this is part of practice. So really, you know, in every supervision session, there are opportunities to widen the gaze and to bring in, you know, these perspectives, these lenses, but also perhaps with more experienced supervisees, it's about coming out of perhaps kind of, you know, everyday clinical interventions, because there might be some confidence around that, into how are we pushing ourselves, and the supervisor modeling anti-oppressive practice and sharing what they're doing, how they're learning, the aspects that they're struggling with, because that will, you know, inform how the supervisee can grow in their practice. Because sometimes supervision can kind of stall or lose momentum after a while, especially if someone's really experienced. It might sort of be a place of, well, you know, they know what they're doing, but actually, because this work is emergent and no one is ever done, there's always something to do.
Yeah. Indeed. Okay, my last question is something I'm asking to everyone that kind of participates in this, and it's like your top two or three suggestions of what supervisors should avoid doing in order to practice in an anti-oppressive way. What are different everyday practices or things people need to keep an eye on in order to sustain that kind of anti-oppressive culture within supervision?
Mhm. Well, I guess the first thing is to avoid making assumptions, because, or to, as best we can, challenge the assumptions or catch our, mind as it's going into a process of making assumptions about identity, assumptions about, power and privilege, and assumptions about, the clients or the service users that we support, because that's really where oppression starts in a very murky and very subtle way, is through these assumptions that then lead to particular behaviors. So I think it's really important, and to find ways to challenge each other when we're going into assumption making, and to actually test our assumptions so that we're able to see, okay, no, it isn't quite like this, or I'm interpreting this through my lens of white supremacy, for example, or through the lens of ableism, and to then be able to critically interrogate that and to find a different possibility. And the second one is really to perhaps kind of not assume that the work is ever done, that you can ever rest in the work. It's quite a negative thing to say, perhaps, because life is exhausting. But it's not assuming that we're ever experienced, or that we've arrived in, even if we've been exploring anti-oppressive practice for decades, there's always more to do. There's always more to learn. The work is never done, and it's assuming that we're experts that then creates oppressive dynamics.
Okay. Thank you. Anything else you want to kind of add to that in terms of things for supervisors to avoid or to kind of keep an eye on in their practice?
I guess, yeah, something to be aware of is the role of shame. So as we're going through our, learning the mistakes that we might make, and we're also in this relational field with our supervisees, we might encounter shame, and that shame can lead to conversations shutting down, or us not being able to contain a conversation or a relationship, and then moving into dominant behaviors that then can be oppressive or colonial, or not feel supportive for the supervisee. So if we can have a sense of our shame sensitivities and be able to work with those, name those, even get support around them, so that when we're going into those places, we can tend to ourselves and then be available for our supervisees, I think that's another thing that can really help.
Yeah. And one thing that chimed with what you said there is that we as supervisors are getting our own support to think through this, to think about how it's affecting us, to think about how we manage, how we regulate our own shame in these kind of conversations. Oh, thank you, Kim. That's been really helpful. Just want to, if you could say something about how people could find out more about the work of kind of Black Psychotherapy and some of the events that you run, how would they do that?
Absolutely. So we have a website, blackpsychotherapy.org. We're also on Instagram at Black Psychotherapy. You can find me on LinkedIn as well, and find us on LinkedIn. And we have our conference on justice in therapy on the 13th of September, and you can find that through our website and also our social media as well.
And that's, yeah, 2025. Now, really looking forward to the
Yes.
conference, but thank you so much for your time today, Kim. Really good
Pleasure.
talking with you.
Thank you so much.